Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan and I'm joined by Michele Levine, who's the CEO of Roy Morgan Research. Roy Morgan has just done its about your 12th annual State of the Nation report on New Zealand. Welcome in, Michele.
Thank you.
And look, you've gone with a theme this year of Auckland v Wellington v the rest of New Zealand. Why have you gone down that route?
Look, we've been looking at the state of the nation and looking at trends in general for many years, and that's interesting, but sometimes the averages cover some very interesting differences. So it was useful to look at people 55 plus because that's an important baby boomer group. But what we found is that it's really interesting also to look at different geographic areas. So in Australia, we've looked at the country people versus people living in capital cities and found some really stark differences. And then we looked at Canberra, our capital, versus the rest of the nation that Canberra governs for. And again, the contrasts were stark. And it just made me think we should have a look at New Zealand and see what it's like between, essentially country areas or non-major cities and the major cities. And then let's see if the Wellington phenomenon is like the Canberra phenomenon.
And basically what your research seems to be saying is, Wellington's nothing really like Canberra, is it? It's much more integrated perhaps with the rest of New Zealand than Canberra is with the rest of Australia.
Yes. So with Canberra is so different to the rest of Australia. We liken it to Disneyland. There's no unemployment, very, very well-educated, employed, socially progressive people, but huge disconnect from the rest of the population. And when we look at Wellington, there's different. They are a little better educated, they are more affluent, they are less likely to be unemployed, but the differences are nuanced. It's like they are still very much part of New Zealand, and that's a good thing, I think.
And then again, I guess Auckland is so much bigger than any other city in New Zealand. It's got its own unique issues too.
Yeah, Auckland's bigger and growing really fast, isn't it? Auckland's growing at something like double the rate of places like Wellington. And the apart from the growth, we're also seeing it's a younger population, so that there's an influx of younger people, and also there's more ethnic diversity and more people that were actually not born in New Zealand. So Auckland's not just growing because everyone else in New Zealand's moving to Auckland, it's attracting people from other countries.
Do you think this is a sort of a long-term issue that New Zealand's really going to have to grapple with in terms of how Auckland's growing and how much more diverse its population is than the rest of the country?
I think, it's an issue whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, because diversity can be fantastic, and different ethnic makeup and different people from different countries is what's driven many countries in the past, isn't it? New people coming in, new blood, enthusiasm, excitement, ready to do whatever it takes to make a success of things. That's always been really good. But the growing pains along the way can be quite tricky.
And I guess the point I'm getting at here is if this is all happening in one part of the country, there's a danger of a disconnect between Auckland and the rest of New Zealand.
Well, there may be a disconnect, or there may just be some differences that people learn to live with. The government could decide they want a fairly consistent New Zealand and put social policies in place to make sure that all the people spread out equally. Governments don't tend to do that these days. I think we sort of live in a world where the people make their own decisions, and I think what we'll see is that people will live in Auckland, they'll do the things that they want to do, and then they'll gradually, as the opportunity arises or as their lives change, they'll decide where in New Zealand they actually want to live.
Now, one of the things you looked at too was housing and home ownership. And I guess not surprisingly, given house prices in Auckland, home ownership in Auckland, the rate of home ownership was lower than in other parts of the country. But and Auckland has the highest percentage of renters and the most crowded houses, shall we say. Can you tell us a little bit about what you turned up in your look at housing?
Well, in the housing market, we have, 32% of people in Auckland actually own their own home, whereas 35% in Wellington, and outside Auckland and Wellington, it's running at about 38% own their own home. So they're nuanced differences, but they're significant. Now, when it comes to home ownership, it's really the older people are, the more likely they are to have got into their own home. Youngsters are sort of getting into their home buying stages later and later. And there's a lot of discussion, both here and in Australia, about how difficult it is for young people to get into the housing market. And when we look at it, there's a bundle of things driving that. And this is particularly the case in Auckland because there is an influx of young people. So you've got young people staying in school longer, more and more people doing tertiary education. So they're not going to be buying houses until they're through school. Then there's increased desire to travel overseas. And young people will often say, I'm going to go overseas before I start saving to buy a home. And then the other thing is technology and the sheer cost of technology. So, it used to be that youngsters would say they'd leave school, they'd find their partner and they'd save up living at home, and the only thing on their mind was getting a new house or getting a house, probably a little old one. Now, the cost of technology is extraordinary. So young people wouldn't dream of living without their mobile phone or without the internet or without all of the apps on their mobile phone in order to save for a home. So people are making choices. They're making really different choices and often choosing to live in student accommodation, groups of people living together. So it's, people will find their own way.
And you've also, in terms of the average number of people per house, Auckland's come in at the top of that.
Yes, Auckland's more likely to have people with 5 or more people living in houses, yes.
And why is that?
Well, I think it's a combination of, people having to live together to cover costs. So that's both student generation, new people moving into the country, and then probably more families that have larger families.
And I guess the ethnic makeup of Auckland with the higher Polynesian population too, they often tend to have bigger families. That's probably a factor in it as well.
The ethnic makeup is probably driving quite a lot of these things, but not all. It's not like it's still a very small minority really that is that group, but a little bit of that.
And you've also made the point that Auckland, obviously the Auckland property market is a huge topic in Auckland all the time, but in New Zealand at the moment,
absolutely,
more widely as well, that you don't see the house prices in Auckland slowing down in terms of their growth anytime soon. Well,
there doesn't seem to be any evidence that they'd slow down, given that they're obviously being driven by this huge population growth, and the housing market's probably not keeping up with that huge population growth. Obviously things like tax policies can change all of this, because the other thing about the housing market is that you've got baby boomers, and that's where the wealth is, the older group, and those folk are often using housing or houses as an investment. So there's like a competing thing driving prices up, not only for people to have a home to live in, but also as an investment. So taxation policy, for instance, that had a capital gains tax on housing would slow that down. There's lots of things that can cut a swathe through what looks like to be a trend that'll never stop.
Now, you've looked at technology as well. That's a big part of your report this year. And that seems to be saying that Wellingtonians are the most technologically savvy, or the most into their technology of New Zealand's population. Yeah.
Well, Wellingtonians are, as we said earlier, they're a bit more affluent, they're well educated, they're employed. So in order to be leading the way in technology, you kind of have to be able to buy it. You have to be able to afford it. It's not inexpensive. And you also have to be of a mind to think the technology is going to work for you. And that definitely comes together in Wellington. So we see probably the pointy end of this is smartphones. And people in Wellington are much more likely to have a smartphone. I think it's running at something like 43%, than people in Auckland, it's lower, or the rest of New Zealand.
And you've also looked at views on the economy and the government in Auckland, Wellington and the rest of the country. And how do they compare?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Overall, you see people in Wellington are a little more open-minded and socially progressive. Not huge differences, but a little more open-minded and socially progressive than, say, Auckland, much more than the rest. But when it comes to the economy, what you find is that people in Wellington are more likely to feel financially secure themselves. They feel they're okay, but they are more likely to be concerned about the rest of New Zealand, they're more likely to be aware that there are problems in New Zealand. They're less likely to think that the government's doing a good job of managing things. So it's an interesting thing, and it probably does come from the fact that they are employed, a lot of them in government employment or close to government. And when you're close to government, you're not only thinking about your own situation, you're thinking about the rest of the nation and even the rest of the world.
And you looked at the wealth and debt levels too, and I guess not surprising given Auckland house prices. Auckland is the wealthiest area, but
Yes.
also has the most debt.
Yes.
But yet you've also got a figure in there showing that Aucklanders, a lower percentage of Aucklanders have mortgages than elsewhere in the country. So that's kind of interesting.
This is a real set of competing themes in that whole area. And I think the thing really is that wealth in New Zealand, household wealth in New Zealand, is very much driven by housing, very much driven by housing prices. So what's happening is that, and it's not that different across the areas. There are little nuanced differences, but it's not hugely different. And you're right, if you take Auckland, the housing prices are higher, but fewer people have them. So the two things cancel each other out. And obviously those people who are in the market and have actually bought houses have had to take out larger mortgages. So this somewhat real difference between housing prices gets washed up, when you look at the whole average thing. But I suppose that's where these averages sometimes can be tricky. So you look at something like consumer confidence and you see interest rates. So if interest rates go up, generally consumer confidence will go down, but among people with mortgages, it will crash. Among self-funded retirees, it'll just, falter a little bit.
Now, in terms of looking at New Zealand between Auckland, Wellington and the rest of the country, how do the differences compare with a similar look in Australia between the big cities and the rest?
Yes. In Australia, the differences between the big cities and the rest are a little more stark. They really are. In Australia, we're actually seeing, if you look outside the major cities, there's a big group of people, really of working age, who are simply abandoning the country areas and coming to the city. So what's left in the country areas is essentially quite a lot older, very conservative, lots of unemployment and underemployment, much more illness associated with the age. So, there's a really strong differential. Of course, there are pockets of areas that are little arts hubs or a particular area that has a particular industry that stand out, those wonderful little jewels, but there's overall a stark difference. The differences that we saw here in New Zealand aren't really as great, and I'm not sure whether that's because it's a smaller country. It may be as simple as that. It may be that if we took tighter areas, like if we took the central part of Wellington, rather than Greater Wellington, we could manufacture huge differences, because we all know there'll be a particular block of houses that is just extraordinary. It'll be really, really different to the rest of New Zealand. So we didn't set about to try and create stark differences. We set about to describe. And I think one of the really important things, as a social researcher, I feel we actually have a responsibility not to create differences, but to describe, because in many ways there are enormous levels of similarity with people. Essentially people are all on about good lives for themselves, good lives for their kids, But
just in terms of the comparisons between Auckland, Wellington and the rest, was there anything that really surprised or startled you?
Not really. I think perhaps as an outsider I just expected more differences. As an outsider I didn't really have the sense that people in Wellington would be so gung-ho when it came to technology. But I now understand that that's one of the areas that Wellington has focused very strongly on, is that whole technology area. And that's interesting in and of itself, because as an area, it's one that's taking up technology. It's the furthest along the technology adoption curve, and that's probably a created thing. That's probably something that Wellington has decided to get into technology, and it then attracts those kinds of people. I didn't expect that from outside, but then someone in Wellington would probably say, of course, no surprises there.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thanks for that, Michele. That's
My pleasure.
Michele Levine, who's the CEO of Roy Morgan Research, And I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.